Hello and welcome to the St. Andrew's Society of Los Angeles podcast. Each episode will bring you the latest news from the St. Andrew's Society of Los Angeles, as well as fascinating interviews with entertainment personalities, government leaders, and community advocates. St. Andrew's Society of Los Angeles, where Scotland meets the City of Angels. Let's get started. Our guest today is Paul Rennie. Paul Rennie is the British Consul General based in Los Angeles, representing the UK government. He previously served at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., leading the Trade and Global Issues Group. He was appointed Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, OBE, by Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II for services to UK-India relations. Consul General Rennie is a Scot and hails from Edinburgh. Please join our president, Kimberly Bradford, for this in-depth interview.
I did want to start off by, obviously, you were born in Scotland. Would you tell us where you're from originally and maybe what you miss most about it?
Sure. So I was born in a small mining village called Rosewell, just outside Edinburgh. And we then moved to Lasswade, which was another small village just up the road when I was about sort of 8 or 9 years old. So Edinburgh is kind of the home I talk about most often because it's the place that most people recognise. But really, we grew up in a kind of small, village, sort of working class village, effectively. And it was, really lovely. It was the kind of classic, I guess, growing up in that time in Scotland where the nights always felt incredibly long in summer and you always got into trouble from your mum or your dad because you'd be out till like 10 o'clock at night when you were sort of 9 years old, like, where have you been? And it was still daylight, that you had no idea it had got so late outside. But then being able to be so close to Edinburgh, went to school in Edinburgh, it was also fantastic because you had this amazing cultural centre right on your doorstep. And I remember from Edinburgh that I used to take for granted the history, this amazing depth of history in the city, this incredible, iconic castle sitting on the middle of the rock in the middle of the city. Was a completely normal thing for a child. But when you start to travel the world, you realize that that's not what every city has. Sitting in the middle of the city is a huge rock with a huge castle on it. And then plus the cultural festivals were just amazing. Every year Edinburgh had the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh, and the city was transformed. You would have thousands of people, actors, shows on every single day. And the streets would come alive with the theatre, with the kind of little shows, with the stand-up comics, with the stand-up theatre. And so I just remember it being a very kind of magically transformative experience, which I guess in retrospect, you'd say an almost Hogwartian experience to live in Edinburgh for all those years.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. What a great area to grow up in as well. What in your young life kind of steered you toward government and what you're doing now?
So it wasn't always my plan to go into government. I think for a while, it's funny, as a Scot, you perhaps navigate two very different parts of your personality. One, of course, is the need for money and the Scots' interest in money. And the second is, I think, a very deep Scottish interest in the community and doing right by the community, because that's how you grow up. I think Scotland's very strong on community. And so when I was younger, I was very much in the money space. I was like, no, lots of money is what I'll need to do. And my degree was in economics at Edinburgh University initially. But as I started to spend more time studying and looking at the kinds of things we were exploring from a policy perspective, I realized that the public policy issues are much more interesting, much more complicated in many ways. And that sort of drew me towards interest in the public sector. And I'm not sure I never really exactly planned to take, a life with the British government, but I certainly was thinking about the World Bank or the IMF or the United Nations, the chance to work in a sort of global environment on public policy, on public good issues. And then, as always with these things, happenstance and chance meetings. And then I'm working for the government in an international role, which to some extent has been the best of all worlds.
Mm-hmm. So we know you speak 5 languages, or maybe now it's probably 5.5 languages. So you speak obviously English, and then there's French, there's Portuguese, there's Hindi, there is Dutch, and of course it's California, so you're learning Spanish now. Are there any other languages you're also attempting to learn? I mean, you pretty much are over. You've already got most of the Romance languages down. Is there anything that you're also learning?
No. I think I'm going to try and get my Spanish properly sorted, which will be important and useful. Also, try and keep my languages up, because it's not just the case you learn a language and can throw it away, wait for it to come back again. But I think there's probably a very West Coast of America language I'm trying to learn as well, because I've spent 4 years in DC in a very government town, and that has a whole set of government language. So I think there's a kind of, if I am learning an extra language right now, it's the language of Los Angeles and the language of California. So that's a big part of my current set of goals at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I was going to say you have a great repertoire of languages, and I was wondering, this might be an indication of where he wants to visit next.
Well, correct. And it's always lovely with languages, because our foreign minister, our diplomatic service, does spend a lot of time teaching us languages. And it makes a huge difference, because as somebody said to me, if you speak someone's language, you can speak to their head. If you speak their native language, you speak to their heart. And I think that is something partly why the UK, US have always had such great relationships, is there's a linguistic connection. Even if people have the familiar phrase of two countries divided by a common language, there's still a linguistic way to connect in that space. But when you travel overseas, you learn a chance to explore a culture in a much more personal way when you speak their language. So when I lived in Brazil, being able to speak Portuguese allowed me to speak with any of the communities I would meet around Brazil, not just speaking English when I met with bankers or senior politicians. I could speak across the board, and that gave you a much richer understanding of what was happening in a country. And so I'm always very grateful. And I should confess up front, I was not a great linguist at school. So it's not as if I came into this profession with a great series of languages under my belt, as both my French and German teachers would tell you with any number of clarity that I was not a great student at languages. But I've ended up with this amazing opportunity to keep learning and keep developing since I started this job.
That's fantastic. So you come from the country of Adam Smith, of course, the father of free trade, and you yourself are also a great proponent of free trade. Did you happen to study Adam Smith while growing up?
Yes, you obviously can't escape Adam Smith. I mean, you're doing economics at university, and the invisible hand is something you learn at school when you're doing economics at school. And it's been very interesting, actually, because it's someone who keeps coming back at different times in my life. So I had a great relationship with Heriot-Watt University in one of my previous roles. And they have what's called the Adam Smith House. So the house that Adam Smith lived in now belongs to Heriot-Watt University. And so I did some events and activities with them, including recently at our embassy in DC, where some amazing scholars of Adam Smith were on a panel discussion. And it was just fantastic to see that someone like that has both had such a tremendous influence, remains so vital and interesting for people, and is a Scot. And, it was only recently, actually, I kind of finally made the time to go and visit his graveyard, which is also in Edinburgh, and his gravesite. And it's interesting that someone who's such a titan of thinking in the economic space has such a simple, gravestone. It's not like it's in a whole museum. It's just there doing its thing. And that's very powerful. But again, Adam Smith spoke very extensively as well about equality and social justice. People remember him for the economics and the wealth of nations. But that wasn't all he wrote. He wrote a lot about social equality and social justice. And I think that's also, again, it almost sounds like classically Scottish again, doesn't it? Like he had this great treatise on money and a great treatise on social justice as well, which I think is the real combination of the Scots.
Right. Well, could you tell us a little bit about the benefits of free trade? And do you believe there should be limits, like tariffs on countries who are trading unfairly?
It's interesting, actually, because we think about the world as kind of different countries and split apart in different ways. But, going back a few hundred years, we divided the world into even smaller units to some extent. So I think to Scotland's own journey, when Scotland and England joined through the Union of the Crowns and the 1707 Act and so on, it cleared away trade barriers between us. We used to have a hard border, and that created trade barriers. And the ability to trade freely, I don't have to stop at the border of Scotland anymore to kind of declare my goods or add tariffs and so on, generated incredible wealth. And so it's clearly the case that the larger you can make that economic trading space, the more beneficial it is for everyone, because it keeps costs down, it allows trade to happen. It's clearly a good thing. But at the same time, any kind of economic activity creates winners and it creates losers. And so there's a question when you have winners and losers within the same country. We use tax to redistribute the opportunity. So people who've fallen behind, we use, taxes to support them, to support education, to support new opportunities. And I think the challenge is when you look at trade between countries, there's obviously no redistribution happening. So if one country has an unfair advantage in trade or creates an unfair advantage, then it can really harm how other countries engage as well. So I think, as somebody once said, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And so I think the price of free trade is to be eternally vigilant about trade. And in my heart, the freer the better. It allows people to get towards their natural skills, their natural capabilities. But at the same time, it has to feel just for the people involved in free trade. And that means, as governments and as any economic would look at, you have to make sure you're getting the right approaches to protecting as well as supporting.
Mm-hmm. Well, next question I have, as you know, Scotland's diaspora around the world is colorful and dynamic. And one has to wonder, this tiny country, Scotland, has had massive appeal around the globe, massive influence. How do you think that happened, and what do you attribute that to?
Oh, it's easy, because much as I love Scotland, it is cold and wet and people can't wait to leave, which means I say in jest, of course, I can't wait to go back. No, but it's true. I mean, Scots have always been travellers. And I think throughout history, and I joke a little bit about, the climate and everything else, but, Scotland is an island that encourages you to find the sun. And in doing so, you take the culture with you, you take the journey with you. And, as I said earlier, I think the combination of both Scottish entrepreneurship has made us very successful as we've travelled the world, America not least. Scots have done incredibly well for hundreds of years in the US. But also the sense of culture that brings with us. And it's not just for me about the culture or the sense of community which Scots have, I think, within their own country, but that they want to build communities in the places they go. They want to be part of the communities when they travel to new countries. And I think they integrate very well with the communities they're from. It's always interesting for me that in spite of how many Scots there are in America, we're not always such a visible community in that sense. And I think it's largely because we fit in very easily. We make friends very easily. We kind of become like the blob of ink in a pail of water, where we spread everywhere. We shade the water slightly, and the water dilutes us and allows us to integrate more effectively. And I think that's why the Scots have done so well, actually. But I think all of us retain an amazing love of where we're from, the sort of slightly cold and slightly grey Scottish days. And like I said, the incredibly long summers and the incredible culture and the just stunning beauty of the place that I'm from and I love to kind of call home. And I think for me, that's why the Scots have done well. We like to travel, we want to travel, and we've worked well with places we've arrived.
Yeah, it's so funny. I think there's an Aberdeen in every single state I've ever visited. So you see a lot of Scottish names, we have a Scotland here, not far from where I live, actually, here in Southern California. So, and there's a Glasgow not far from it. So
there's about 3 dozen Glasgows. I remember when we had the COP summit in Glasgow. This is the climate summit a couple of years ago. I was like, I wonder how many other Glasgows there are in America. And there's about 2 or 3 dozen. I mean, there's a lot. It's a lot out there.
Yeah, exactly. So your background of policymaking and analysis, as well as having an economics background, are great attributes to have in your current role. They're great assets to have. How do these attributes translate into your role right now?
Well, I think for me, straightforwardly, a big part of my role is helping growth, helping the growth agenda, and that's also what the Prime Minister has been very clear about. You know, our role overseas is to help support growth in the UK, and I think any growth in the UK is mutually beneficial for creating jobs and growth in America at the same time. And I think having the economics background helps me understand a lot more about what is it that makes the economies work? How is it we can find ways to collaborate together? How is it we can find opportunities? And, you know, for me, these things should always be about mutual benefit. We're not here simply to say, oh, how can we sell you things? Or any more than Americans are like, how can you buy our things? There's a real opportunity that if we collaborate effectively, if we trade effectively, everybody wins. And, you know, I think recently the great success is something like Baby Reindeer, you know, a kind of born in the Scottish, you know, born in the fringe in Edinburgh. You know, I'm sure for Netflix, not one of its big blockbusters they thought out the door was going to be an amazing success, but bringing together, you know, great British, great Scottish talent with a great American film company allowed us to create a worldwide success. So, you know, Scotland, Britain plus America equals worldwide success. And I think that for me is the sorts of collaborations that I'd like to find in this role. But I'd have to say, you don't have to be a great economist to figure that out. So I don't know how much of an edge it gives me, but maybe it's more obvious than some.
Mm-hmm. Last year, you were involved with the UK's first AI Safety Summit. And I think I quote, or you were quoted as saying, the job we are having here is not to get some kind of ceiling, but to try and set a common understanding of a floor. And I thought that was a great quote. And as we all know, AI is the hot subject right now. Do you see any limitations or dangers with the development of AI?
It's interesting, I think, with any new technology that you are trying to find ways to harness it. You know, so when the motor car was first invented, you know, people didn't see many risks associated with it until people started getting hit by motor cars. They were like, oh, wait a minute, this is a challenge. Right. But the job is not then to stop the development of the motor car. The job was then to figure out, how do we harness this technology? You know, and the same was true for drug discovery. You know, for decades, people would be selling drugs that were just snake oil products or harmful products. Until at some point, things like, you know, federal regulations arrive. And it didn't stop innovation. It didn't stop competition. And what it did do is give the customer a sense of certainty that products they were buying were safe, that were actually going to be beneficial, that had a minimum standard, that did what they said they did. And it also meant for companies that were behaving well, they had protections, that if you didn't have the right support, if you didn't have the right safety mechanisms, you couldn't sell your drugs or sell your motor car. And I think the same is true for me with AI, is that there's an enormous amount of potential in this system. You know, and it's interesting as to how much of our jobs we could be made more efficient in. I mean, if I never have to do another expenses form in my life, I'll be a happier man for it if AI is making that possible for me. But I don't think AI is ever going to stop the bits of my job that I love, like the human interactions we have with people, or the chance to engage in new moments and new experiences. So from that perspective, I am a massive optimist on AI. I really want to find as many ways we can use to embrace it. And even at a macro level, things like drug discovery have been hugely enhanced potentially with the use of AI, and things like, you know, AlphaFold, which looked for new proteins in the UK, is one of our big AI systems out there. So I see huge opportunity, but like any new technology, it has to be done in a safe way that has the public trust. And the risk always with these things, if the public don't have the trust, people feel they would rather not have the technology at all. And that would be a loss, I think, ultimately.
Right. Well, that's a great analogy with the car. So I know you've only been here a few weeks, but what are you hoping to achieve in the next 12 months while you're here in this post? I know you're here for 4 or 5 years, or at least. But what would you like to achieve in this 12 months that you're here, the first 12 months?
Well, Kimberly, as a newcomer in town, it'd be nice to make some friends, wouldn't it, over the next one?
You haven't had a problem with that whatsoever. I know.
And it's funny, I say that partly in jest because there's a very human element to being new in any location, but also professional level. You know, a big part of my work out here is to fly the flag for the UK. And as a Scot, I get to fly, you know, a number of flags in that regard, as both a proud Scot and a proud Brit in these senses. When I'd say I'd like to make friends, it's I genuinely want to find, you know, friends for the work that we're doing, friends for the themes and opportunities that we care about, friends who share the same commitment we have on issues like climate change or issues around AI and technology, issues around supporting jobs and growth and business opportunities. And so for me, achieving in the 12 months looking forward would really be a chance to say we've made great connections. We've made great connections and great links into communities, obviously the Scottish community through this podcast, but any number of other communities in LA that want to work with us. But more importantly than that we're making links that are generating real returns for people, that people can see the value of that relationship. It's, you know, nice to have friends, but at the same time, the reason the British taxpayer supports my presence here is to support their engagement and support their opportunities as well. I think being able to look back over the next 12 months and say, you know, we've met some great people, we've done some great things, and we've really helped to push forward the right agendas between the UK and the US in this part of the world. So for me, that's what I think the first 12 months would look great at. And plus, as a Scot, if there's the opportunity to catch a little bit of sun and turn my skin a slightly less transparent shade than it currently is, that would also be a win. I hear LA's right for the weather, so you can't miss that chance, can you?
Being that this is Hollywood, and as you know, I have to ask the inevitable, what is your favorite film?
It's interesting. I've been asked that a few times, and it's so hard to come up with one answer. I love movies. I love all aspects of movies. I love the black and white films, great Elm Street productions like Man in the White Suit, or some of the Frank Capra greats like, you know, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I love some of the films, you know, from the 1980s that were kind of great blockbusters of the day. You see them in the big movie theaters. But also interesting how much TV has come along. So shows like The Wire, that were breakthrough opportunities for people like Idris Elba and Dominic West. And then the Shonda Rhimes work is also fantastic. I mean, things like Bridgerton. She recently received an honour, actually, from the UK government for this work, which has been really, really fantastic. But at the same time, it's funny, if I were to come back to one movie I do love and is to some extent a little bit exemplar, it would be Groundhog Day with Bill Murray. This kind of wonderful day where over and over again, he repeats the same day for people that haven't seen it, and in a fantastically Bill Murray-esque way. And the reason I like that is because from day to day, he can carry no wealth. He cannot take anything with him. He doesn't, you know, whatever money he's made by gambling or winning, or in one case, robbing a bank, he can't take it with him. But he can take his knowledge from day to day. And every day he learns the piano and he learns French and all these things from day to day. And of course, each day, nobody remembers the day's repeated. It's just him that knows the day has gone on. And as I was telling to somebody, I realized it's sort of a metaphor for my life as a diplomat, where, you know, I spend all these days traveling between different countries and different opportunities. And I can't always take the things with me, not least America's got 110 volts, all my electrical equipment has to stay behind. But also people have to learn me from scratch and learn working with me from the beginning. But every posting I take my knowledge. And so every time I'm in any country, the most valuable thing I can do is not to acquire things, it's to acquire knowledge and learning. And so I guess I love Groundhog Day as a movie, and I guess it's become a slightly symbolic movie given the career I've chosen to find myself in.
Focus of government organizations in the past has changed from really, I would say, a purely sort of diplomatic role originally, and now it's more commercial. It's about building relationships. Is this the principal goal, would you say now, of the UK government?
I don't think it's the principal goal. I mean, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary as well have set out a number of priorities, you know, of which the commercial and growth relationship is obviously critically important. They've obviously highlighted security as part of that journey too. I mean, one of the most important roles any government can play is to keep its citizens safe. And I think particularly when you look at, you know, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you know, the horrific consequences that have now been going on for several years, it's a reminder why traditional diplomacy has not gone out of fashion. You know, the need for us to be able to engage to understand where communities are coming from, to support peace, to recover peace where it is lost, to cement peace where it seems fragile. That security is an absolutely fundamental part of our landscape as well. And then at the same time, things like our climate agenda, climate and energy agenda, how do we create a kind of, living on a sustainable planet? And sustainable not just in the case, of course, of the kind of climactic elements around that, but also sustainable in terms of wealth creation and poverty alleviation and poverty elimination in that space. And again, it's another core commitment of our work. And likewise, when it comes to other issues to do with the technology race and how we can kind of support that, global pandemics. Of course, the COVID pandemic was a big reminder of how these things came together. And at the heart of all of that is, I think, the skill of diplomacy. It's funny, I was thinking the other day that there's very few professions you use to describe other people. I mean, any number of us would have said, oh, that's very diplomatic of you at some point in their life. No one's ever said, that's very doctorly of you, or that's very lawyerly of you, or that's very construction workery of you. To be very diplomatic is something people understand. And that diplomacy is there when we talk about big challenges. It's there when we talk about conflict. It's there when we talk about supporting an economic and trade relationship. And it's built through, I think, understandings of where people are coming from, understandings of how to engage and support, understanding how to find balance and compromise. And that often in compromise means nobody's completely happy, but everybody is better off. Mm-hmm. And I think these skills in that regard are essential to diplomacy. The question ultimately is, when the government of the day comes into the UK, where does it choose to direct those skills of diplomacy, and how best do we make those work? And I think it's certainly true that, commerce is a big part of our agenda, but so as it has been since the first cave person took their rock and tried to swap it with a rock in the neighbouring cave. Then was diplomacy and commerce born.
So knowing more about you now, and observing you, I know you're kind of a student learning. You love challenging yourself, and you cover a very large territory. So let's name your territory right now. Your territories: Southern California, Arizona, Nevada, Hawaii, Utah, U.S. territories of Guam, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands, which we were talking about prior to the podcast starting. Were these smaller areas of the world or of the territory, knowing that you would be in this position, did this have a great influence on you? Because you don't get many opportunities to go to Guam or American Samoa, and I'm sure that they're amazing places. How much of that had a bearing on your decision to come here?
So there's no question that the diversity of what I have in my consular area was a big draw to coming to do this job. And it's, again, I'm saying this personally, and I am, of course, completely biased. I think it's not just one of the best, if not the best patch in America, one of the best patches in the whole of the world to be working in. I literally have some kind of incredible desert landscapes through parts of Arizona. I have snow-capped mountains through Utah. I have major thriving metropolitan cities like, San Diego or Los Angeles. I have entertainment capitals like Las Vegas in Nevada, and some amazing landscapes in Nevada as well. And then I have the tropical islands in Hawaii. And then these incredible communities in Guam and American Samoa and the Northern Mariana Islands, which, played an enormous role in World War II, of course, in terms of their engagement and their use in the Pacific theatres. And I think when you look at that kind of diversity, you can't help but be excited. It's not just that it's a kind of diverse geographical and geological landscape. It's a diverse community as well. The way that, as I said, as a Scot, Scotland's very diverse. You have the communities in Edinburgh and Glasgow, very much the city living. You have the Highland communities that can feel more rugged and more separated. And then obviously island communities that are much more further removed and live in very different ways in Orkney and Shetland and so on. Mm-hmm. All bound together by being Scots, of course, in that journey, but still feeling a strong sense of their individuality from the communities they're from. And that's what I find so exciting, is there's the communities in American Samoa will be very different to the communities in Los Angeles and very different to the communities in Phoenix. And I think that for me is the excitement around it, that staying in one country, one sense of a kind of, all of the United States support and kind of architecture, and yet feeling such differences in how these places operate. And of course, the territories themselves are not states. They're a different entity altogether when it comes to how they operate and engage, which again will generate a different perspective of what it means to be part of the American family and part of the American structures. So yes, I think no one thing brought me to it, but all these things added together just make the most rich pastiche you could imagine.
So I know you're an avid reader, Consul General Rennie, as am I. Do you think that one day you will look towards writing books yourself? And do you already have a subject in mind or a title picked out?
What an interesting question. I think I love reading. Whether you can master the craft of writing as well is a very different story. I mean, I love watching tennis. Whether my tennis game is any good or not is a separate story. But it's funny because I do, over the years, I've talked a lot about diplomacy, about the craft of diplomacy. And from time to time, people have suggested, putting some thoughts down on paper. And I used to write blogs in different guises. And it's interesting because I think diplomacy can sometimes feel like a very grand art, like a sort of thing that's very textbook and very academic, and very serious books need to be written about diplomacy. But I actually think that diplomacy is a completely innate characteristic for every single person out there. And people are practicing it every day. And so I think if I were ever to write a book, it would be about the sort of, the real simplicity of diplomacy, how it's not some kind of highfalutin art. It is an everyday concept and something that people can use every day. But there's also some tips and tricks and, insider ways. If you do it a lot, you begin to realize the shortcuts to getting things done, which again, I suspect a lot of people use every day. So yeah, maybe that might be the journey. It's either that or clearly the next great American novel. Just give me 4 more years and I'll be up there with Gatsby.
Which is another great book right there, actually. Okay, so we hear that you are a competitive archer. So we'll talk about archery. How long have you been practicing? Is it something you still do? Does this talent, I mean, does it take a lot of skill? Well, obviously it takes a lot of skill, but does it make you a fan of films like Lord of the Rings or Brave or The Hunger Games?
It's funny. So I think it's been a long time since I did competitive archery. I probably stopped not long after university because I just couldn't keep the time in, keep the hours in. I do still shoot from time to time. I should emphasize it's all target archery. There's no hunting. It's not allowed in the UK. It's not something I do anyway. So it's all just target archery. I have got a target that I've moved around the world from time to time, which I can get my bow out occasionally and shoot at. I would like to get back into it a bit more. And this is very inside baseball or inside archery, I guess. But Las Vegas hosts an annual tournament in archery, which when we were kids in Scotland seemed like the most distant and far-flung place to ever get to was Las Vegas. But it's now just down the road. So I might need to see if I can kind of get myself up to a skill level that involves not bringing harm to anyone around me with my bow and arrow. And maybe I might head down to Vegas for one of these shoots. And it's funny because archery goes through ebbs and flows. And so I got into it, I think, because I used to run around the garden with bamboo canes bent into bow shapes. And at some point, my mum got fed up with me flinging these arrows around the house. So she got me signed up to an archery club in Lasswade Archery Club. And but of course, every time like the new Robin Hood movie would come out with Kevin Costner, there'd be a whole pile of new kids would show up at the archery club. And then whenever Lord of the Rings comes out, a whole pile of new kids would show up at the archery club. And so it's funny, whenever I see it in movies and films, of course, it's I'm sure it's like everything. I'm sure when doctors watched the series ER, they were like, well, that's not how it happens in real life. Or when the police watch CSI Miami, they're like, the cops would never do that. And so when I'm watching archery, his technique is terrible in Lord of the Rings. Legolas shouldn't pull a bow like that at all. So it must make me a terrible guy to watch archery movies with. And I'm like, Robin Hood would never be that good in real life.
Oh, that's fantastic. So before I get to our last question, it reminded me of the thought of Burns, and of course, most Scots, well, all Scots and many non-Scots around the world revere Robert Burns, and of course, we're no different. Our Burns Supper is of course our big event for the year. If you had the chance to sit with Burns and ask him one question, is there something in mind that you would ask him?
Wow, what a good question. I think the thing with Burns is that he has such a legacy. It would be almost impossible to ask him one question. Well, actually, if I asked him one question, it would probably be, tell me your story, tell me your journey. And then I'd just sit and listen. Because it's such an interesting legacy. And I wonder sometimes, I mean, he wrote in such great terms, and it's become such a powerful legacy, but I can't imagine he ever thought this is what he would create when he wrote. I mean, I think many people write with aspirations of grandeur, and when the founding fathers drafted the American Constitution, they probably knew that document would hang around for a bit and have a bit of importance. But I think when Robert Burns crafted what he did, I think he couldn't have imagined what a kind of touchstone it became of Scottish culture and Scottish legacy over the years, that some of the most famous moments are not about a Scottish independence battle. They are the Burns Supper. They are a celebration of a poet. And again, I think that cultural tradition runs deep. I mean, I think it's still the case that the Walter Scott Memorial in Edinburgh to Sir Walter Scott. People who've not seen it, you can look up the Walter Scott Monument, sometimes known as the Gothic Rocket. It is this most ridiculous sculpture. But it is the largest statue to a writer in the world, I think. And the fact that the biggest writer statue in the world is not, in some massive city, but in Edinburgh to a Scottish writer, I think says a huge amount about how the Scots value literature and value understanding. But I think also someone like Burns and others who've written in the years, there's a great deal of humility in that there's a kind of a story of the every person to their journey, which I think, again, to come back to this point about community, is why Scots fit in so well. They just want to listen to your story. And that would probably be a long answer to your question, Kimberly, but I think that'd be my question to Burns, be sort of like, tell me your story. What's your story, Robert?
Yeah, and great answer. And, I look at people like Frederick Douglass, who's one of my favorite people in history, and he revered Robert Burns so much that he went to visit his grave, his family, the Robert Burns home while he was there. So he even had an impact 150 years ago, and it continues to build on. But great answer about Burns. So okay, let's pretend that your post here is winding down, whether it's 4, 5, or 6 years from now. What are you hoping to leave behind? What would you like your legacy to be here?
I think almost legacy is too grand a word to talk about. My feeling with diplomacy is always it's in the detail. It's where diplomacy really happens and really makes a difference. And I think what I would like to have left when I leave here is that we've affected people's lives in a positive way. I have to do my job. I will have to grow our relationship. I will want to grow our relationship and grow the business and grow all these things. But what I really will take most pride in is having been able to use my role and my position to change and influence the individual lives around me, and particularly lives that maybe haven't thought about coming to Scotland or coming to Britain, or that the Consul General would take an interest in what they're doing. And in the kind of rather grand world of this, His Majesty's Consul General and all the title and the resonance that goes with it, it's a great opportunity to bring a spotlight to people who don't get much chance to be in the spotlight. And that's not my gift. That's not a gift of Paul Rennie personally. That is, the British government and all it represents helps to bring that journey with them. But my personal nature is, how do I direct that and how do I engage? And so I really hope that in the course of the next 4 years, we will have just wonderful, very individual stories of us connecting with communities, of us connecting with, friends across my consular region, to the people really feel that we have not just been a sort of, a British footprint, but very much a part of the community wherever we have been, and helping to make that work. So I think for me, that will be the stories I'll tell in 4 years' time. I bet it will be about individual moments of success, of individual moments of amazement, and individual friendships that I've made along the way.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, thank you for taking the time out to have this interview with us, Consul General Rennie. And I know you've only been here a few weeks, but I think you've covered more ground than anyone else has in several years. And I know it really speaks volumes of your desire to just really be here for the community as well as for Great Britain. So we really appreciate you coming, and we're so happy you're here. As you can see, I think you've had more welcome parties than I've seen in quite a while.
Well, thank you. Thank you. But I think everyone has been incredibly kind and incredibly generous with their time. So I guess, as they say in LA, it feels like my kind of town.
Oh, that's great. I think that was Chicago, though.
Oh, well, it should be LA.
Well, LA adapts everything as its own anyway, so. But thank you so much, Paul, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the St. Andrews Society of Los Angeles podcast. For more information on the St. Andrews Society of Los Angeles, visit www.standrewsla.org. And don't forget to like our Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube channels as well. Have a great week, and we'll see you next episode.